Welcome to another edition of Think Human. Today we have James Trezona with us from Rooster. I've known Rooster for years now. I actually worked with them back at a previous company, and ever since we first met, we've been talking about storytelling. So I'm really, really happy to get him onto this series and share his thoughts with you. James, do you want to give yourself a brief introduction before we sort of dive in?
Sure, absolutely. So Rooster, we were founded as a storytelling agency back in 2013. We very much B2B, so this was kind of before B2B storytelling was a thing. And I remember having to explain it. And that's very much our how. Our why is humanizing. We want to humanize it because it's a sector which really needs it. We kind of work with a lot of tech clients, a lot of finance clients. It's kind of putting human values and also the ability to relate and empathize in a more human way and behave in a more positive human way as well, because our kind of vision is for brands to do more good in the world. So human isn't just about how we talk, but it's also about acting in a more sustainable, more responsible way. So that's our kind of vision. But yeah, our kind of how we do it is storytelling always has been. It's our mantra, and it's at the heart of everything we do. So
even having talked to you over the years and having it built in me to, we need to tell a story, we need to make sure it as you say, it's got that full sort of context around it and that sort of broader picture. When you've done it, even when I've done it and known that I was doing that, you look at the end result and you're like, it's still a little bit features and benefits, isn't it? It's not quite where we wanted it to be.
Yeah, and change is hard. Obviously, for instance, we've been talking about behavioral science and neuroscience for decades. Frankly, I remember talking about NLP back in the 90s in marketing, and actually our ability to integrate new ways of thinking is poor. And also when you've typically got companies which are really driven by maybe founders who are tech heads and the guys with the money, the product managers who are funding the marketing, they want to talk about the new widget that they've just spent the last year designing. So why wouldn't you talk about that? I've got teams of people working on that, and it's very hard to sort of turn around and have a conversation and say, look, actually your customer doesn't care.
Yeah.
Customer doesn't want to hear about widgets. And there maybe was a time when the widgets were interesting, when tech was just taking off in the early noughties. Actually, Sony Bravia was talking about Triniton, and it was the kind of technology actually was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But now, if you think about classic maturing, people, there's still some people who love talking tech, but actually most buyers don't. Most buyers of technology, marketing technology, not actually people who didn't grow up in technology. Their eyes will glaze over instantly when you start talking about terabytes and latency and all those sort of things which maybe used to get people interested. There has been a fundamental shift in the way people buy. So if you think about some of the mechanisms, it used to be that people were kind of reliant on you to tell them about the product, because they'd need to get the data sheet from you. They'd need to get, good old days when it was like manuals, there's physical stuff that have to go and talk to a salesperson. Yeah. The internet has meant that actually they're going to do most of that product research themselves. Before they speak to you, they're going to actually know, frankly, sometimes more about the product than you do, because they will spend maybe weeks assessing a long list of vendors. So by the time they want to talk, they're talking to you. Actually, they don't want to. They've done the research. Don't insult them and imply that they don't know about what they're buying. What they want at this point to really make the decision is to understand you. Can I buy into this company? Are they going to live up to the promises? Rory Sutherland often quotes a great piece of research which pointed out that it's not about fear of making the wrong choice in B2B. It's about fear of getting blamed, because actually it's not like buying a bad pair of jeans. We've all made fashion errors, right? But if you go with the wrong, cloud system, even SaaS, where you think you can swap in and out, but if you've lobbied to your CEO and she said, yeah, go on, yeah, cool, I trust you, make this decision, we're going to move all our data centers to the cloud, well done you. And you've gone to the wrong vendor who sold you a vision, but actually isn't that easy? That's career limiting. This is, you know, having to have a tricky conversation with the wife about how suddenly your career prospects aren't as good as they were. So, you know, actually trust. It's about trust. And how do you gain trust? Well, storytelling actually is fundamental to that, because you've got to go back to how humans relate, how society relates, how tribes are created. And it's about stories, it's about narratives. And so it's to kind of get to the fundamentals of, even from a neuroscience point of view, why stories work.
Yeah.
It actually helps us understand how important they are, and not ending up going back to just talking about speeds and feeds.
Yeah. What is it about storytelling? You talk about neuroscience, you talk about going back and it just connecting with us. What is it about storytelling? Why is it that storytelling is such a powerful connector for us?
Yeah. Again, I mean, and this is where it gets interesting, right? Because you go back, you rewind and think about, before, the printed page, before even writing was possible, the way that we kept ourselves alive, but also created social groupings and social cohesion, was through story. And that's why I remember things. So if you look at the way the brain is wired, without going into complex stuff about the amygdala and how it relates with the neocortex, etc., there's probably three things to understand. So cortisol. So people might know what cortisol is, but essentially it's your stress hormone.
Okay.
Small amounts are good, big amounts are bad. But so cortisol is produced when you're worried about something, and actually it clouds decision making. Actually, when you see people in high stress environments, the decisions get worse. And so, but it can be a way in. It can be a way to get attention, to trigger a pain. So often, again, people think about pain, talking about worst case scenario or kind of fear-based advertising. That gets attention, but it doesn't necessarily get what we need to get, which is kind of empathy. So to go through that. So cortisol, I've got a problem, I don't know how to solve it. All stories, we'll get into the kind of specifics of this, but if you imagine it, start with context, but there's got to be a conflict which you're solving, whether they know you can solve it or not, but there's something, some need for change, some trigger. So cortisol is being produced off the back of that. As soon as you recognize you're being told a story, your brain lights up. And a couple of things around the kind of trust sensors and some of your social sensors light up. And they start to prime for the release of dopamine. Now, dopamine's been in the news, let's say, a lot in the last 5-ish years, because it's seen as being addictive. It's what, the phones, you get a dopamine release when you get the lovely little bing of someone responding to your WhatsApp or liking your Instagram feed, right? So dopamine is important, but it's short term. Okay. And it's kind of addictive, but that's slightly overemphasized. It's a short term kind of pleasure reinforcement stimuli. Great. But actually, that's not storytelling's magic, because that's what Instagram has, but that's not storytelling. Where storytelling, the resolution of storytelling, of a story, actually creates power is through the release of oxytocin.
Okay.
So oxytocin, so parents might know this because it gets talked about a lot in NCT classes. Oxytocin is the love hormone. It's about bonding, and it's about empathy. And so when a story starts to resolve, and you are starting to buy into the characters in the story, and starting to understand its relationship for you, and so you've fired up your imagination, you start to get a release of oxytocin. Mm-hmm. And that is an empathetic drug. And so suddenly, rather than just thinking about the product you're looking to buy, you start to empathize with the brand, the salesperson, whatever, the situation. And that's what drives relationships. So ultimately, whilst cortisol and dopamine are part of the kind of neurochemistry, actually the real power is the oxytocin release that happens when a good story, which actually taps into some of my deeper feelings of who I am, my own narrative, and aligns it in a kind of way that builds basically trust and empathy between the two or more parties. And that's the science of story. That's why it works. And that's why if you're just talking about product, you're never going to do that.
Yeah, you switched them off before you even started, haven't you? What is it about the structure of the story that connects with the user? What are the fundamentals that you need to actually get there?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number, and sometimes quite conflicting points about how many fundamental stories there are in the world. And I mean, we have our own IP around this. We talk about 6 kind of primary talks of stories, and it's based off the back of some other research. But I think the important thing is not so much whether there are 3, 6, 10, or 12. It's that there are actually very few. And recognizing that actually, the stories you're telling probably fit into one of these. And it might be a story about a hero story, and she's going out there and she has to fight an adversary, or maybe it's a redemption story where they were one place but need to move to another place, or it's a story of overcoming of insurmountable odds, which is not about battling an enemy, but it's almost about the environment being the adversary. So these are all very different stories, and so what you want to do is, as I say, we can kind of talk about the specifics of potential storylines, and I think that gets a bit complicated, but it's more around the important thing of saying, look, recognize what your customer's narrative is. What is she fighting? Is it all around, look, we've got this one big competitor and we need to be better than them, and this is, and which in itself can be actually a bit misleading, because okay, so what is it, because all stories about change, what is the change you're looking to create? For instance, we engaged with the client last year who was really fixated on one of the competitors, and so it would have been easy to say, well, okay, this is about an adversarial story, but actually when we dug into it, that wasn't really the truth. The truth was that was distracting them. And so we got them to flip the narratives in the company. So instead of talking about the other company, which can be disruptive, we got them to focus on actually not just their customers, but what their customers were doing, and the output, the outcomes of enabling their customers, and shining a light on that, as opposed to fixating on what their competition was doing. So they stopped talking about the competition and they started, sounds like a kind of obvious of being customer centric, but it's a bit more subtle, because it's talking about, look, it's not just the customers, it's the customers' outcomes. It's the wonderful thing our customers are doing. So it's kind of 2 stages removed that they really hadn't talked about so much. And talking about funding the wonderful was the ending up story, is an overarching narrative. So this was for Crowdcube, where they fundamentally were able to, because it had always been in them, good stories shouldn't be something which feel alien or completely as an agency coming in. You should be uncovering truths as opposed to dictating something new. And absolutely what you find is these narratives exist, but they maybe haven't surfaced because people do go back to talking about speeds, feeds, platforms, how many people we've got on the platform, how quickly we can do things for you. Well, actually, no, let's take a step back and talk about what fundamental changes you are able to create, because all stories about change, context, conflict resolution, the character, how's it changing, and what we are within that, whether we are the guide, whether we're an enabler, whether we are also heroic as well. Where do we want to fit into that story as a character? We use archetypes, so Jungian archetypes can also help guide those stories. So if you're familiar with that, that can help define the story to say, look, are we someone who is a ruler brand, who is, without necessarily being arrogant, but is very much expected to lead the way? Or are we much more of a compassionate healer brand? Or are we a joker and a jester? So suddenly when you start to personify the brand and think about storytelling from the point of characters, and you as a brand are a character within the story and not always the hero. Sometimes you're just the enabler, or the kingmaker behind the scenes. Recognize your place. You can start to think of stories in a more nuanced ways. As I say, keep it simple. There's only young, whole world, 12 archetypes. What one are you? Okay, it's oversimplifying, but you've got it.
You do. And actually, I think you made a really interesting point there around the idea of authenticity a little bit, and this connectedness, right? I think the days of your marketing being able to present something to the world being not related to how the company itself is actually quite difficult today, because of how easy it is to understand how companies behave both internally and externally as a business.
Absolutely.
And so,
and there's a higher expectation of continuity, congruency between what you're saying you are and what you actually are, and the expectation and that's not just driven by customers, that's driven by employees, and it's not just millennials and Gen Zs. Absolutely, as people are able to move jobs faster and have greater expectations that they're bringing their whole selves to work, especially when we're now working from home and not just going to an office and putting on a suit and having to conform. It's like, how does the purpose and the fundamental mission of this company align with what I believe in as a person is really important.
Yeah.
And that then informs how they're going to engage with customers. And if you're not authentic to that, so whenever we work with brand projects or even just campaigns, you start inside out. You start with, okay, what is the culture of the company? When we're doing investigation calls with people in the company and their customers, we talk about the culture. What do these people stand for?
Yeah.
What do you like about them? How do they make you feel? Because that's what people remember. It's stories.
Yeah.
They won't remember the specifics. It's how they made you feel. How did that story make you feel? What place did it transport you to? When we talk about how stories are incredibly powerful at making things more memorable, it's really because what happens, your brain engages in an imaginative place.
Yeah.
And when you're actually starting to envisage in your own mind, that is far more memorable because you are creating things. We're very bad at taking in facts and data. We just don't remember stuff,
Yeah.
And actually, there is some really good theory around the fact that all memory is imagination. We think that it's like a database of pictures. It's not. Actually, when you look at the bits of the brains that light up, other than spatial memory, I finding my way from here to Tesco's, all the rest of it's imagination, which shows how malleable it is. And
Yeah.
so the only way you remember things is when your imagination has been involved and you reimagine it. As marketeers, the interesting thing is, look, narratives are shifting. They're incredibly powerful. We define ourselves through narrative.
Yeah.
Again, a lot of research has been done in the very recent time, looking at divisions, polarization of society. What's driving that? Why is that happening? It's because we are more than ever defined by narrative. In truth, it's always been the case, but more than ever, we used to be defined by our family, people around us physically, our physical spaces, the town we lived in, because people didn't move outside that much. Now we spend our lives interfacing with people on the internet. We spend more than ever right now under lockdown, but it's not just a lockdown thing. We are defined by the narratives of the people we engage with, and you create things like echo chambers. You get into that kind of, but that continues to exacerbate that kind of trend, which means we are massively narrative dependent, massively narrative driven. And as you start to understand that as a marketeer, that narrative is fundamentally how people construct reality, then it gets interesting to say, okay, what is our narrative? Because a story shouldn't be complex. It shouldn't be something which is hard to remember or has a whole load of detail to it.
Yeah.
It should be a broad, overarching story, like Volvo safety. They've been talking about the safety story for ever.
Yeah.
And they found ways to reinvent it. They found ways to make it real. The fact that they didn't launch a electric car because safety concerns. Batteries when they crash, not a good thing. So they fundamentally live it and breathe it. But it's a very simple story. It's an emotional story. You can talk to a new parent in a very different way than you might talk to somebody, a truck driver. But it's an overarching narrative, which if I align with it, most people at certain points in their lives, okay, safety is a core consideration when you're driving something around at 70 miles an hour, which weighs 3 tons. It works. And so you can create stories within that, and it should light up the ability for people to also create their own narratives that fit into this. Because great stories, great grand narratives are ones which people should own. We spend an awful lot of time going, okay, what's our contact strategy? What's our messages? What's our routes to market? How much paid media should we do?
Yeah.
And yet we fundamentally know, all of us know that the most powerful mechanism to drive sales is word of mouth and referrals.
Yeah.
You don't want cold prospects coming in who've never really heard of you and none of their peer group has ever bought from you. Absolutely, the most powerful way of marketing is to, especially now they're doing most of their research before contacting you, is to give people a story which they can whether they buy from you or not, sometimes these don't have to be customers that are becoming advocates. It's actually a lot of the time you're getting people who are just bought into your story.
Yeah.
And they then become the most powerful form of marketing. Because, as I say, this isn't about sharing disinformation. This is about sharing truths, authentic truths. They want to be able to turn around and say, hey, look, this brand I buy from, they're amazing. Look what they're doing. In COVID, they did these amazing things where they reached out to the community and engaged with local arts institutions to help them, and did all this wonderful. So suddenly things like CSR, which was always a bit of a sideline, weave those stories in because they're real and authentic. And as long as they align with what you stand for and don't feel tangential,
yes,
you create those stories. And it's not just outside the organization, one peer group talking to another buyer from another organization. Fundamentally, when you're looking at complex decisions, building momentum within a team is so important, because you might know, one or two of the decision makers or even just decision influencers, but how is she going to persuade her colleagues? How is she going to frame the story in a way that the CFO is going to listen to, and then the CFO when she's talking to the CEO? Okay, how is that story going to work? And so you need a meta narrative which is kind of flexible enough to work for all of those, but then think about those individuals. Context, conflict resolution. What's the context they currently have? What's the problems they're facing? What conflicts are we helping them solve? Because they're not just buying your thing in isolation. They've got a whole bunch of other things going on in their brain. How are you going to cut through? How can you be remarkable? How can you be the thing that they want to bring up in that board meeting where they say, look, really interesting. These guys, I think, have got a solution for this problem, and this is why I trust them, and I've got a good feeling about them, and I want to go with them, because all decisions are taken emotionally. Again, back to the neuroscience, we are quite good at rationally deselecting. So, it's way too expensive. They haven't got any presence in America. They don't support this X, Y, Z. Often that's delegated down, that kind of deselection activities, whereas, okay, go and do a pilot, go and do some cost pricing models, etc.
Yeah.
All decisions are emotional. It's one tiny bit of your brain does it. Therefore, if you haven't engaged with why should I buy into you, not just buy from you? Why should this story resonate? Am I able to retell it if the CEO corners me in the lift and she says to me, hold on, look, we're about to do all this thing with this vendor I've never heard of. Why should I do that? You're not going to talk to her about the fact that they're terabyte processing. What's the story you can tell her? The elevator pitch.
Yeah.
Elevator pitches are not about facts and figures. They're about a story. So what can you tell that person in that moment? Put yourself in the buyer's shoes. She's got to be able to explain herself.
Thank you very much, James. It's been a pleasure.
As always. Thank you for having me on. Really appreciate it. Love the other stuff you've done. So hopefully I'll meet that high bar.
Yes, yes, without fail, James.